Welcome everyone to our March Plain English Roundtable. In this Roundtable series, we've been talking about issues about communication and how it affects how business communication affects how well they communicate with their customers and business partners. With the help of industry experts and using real case studies, we've been exploring these issues further, and we outline strategies for improving business communications and providing practical takeaways for companies to incorporate into their workflows right now. Our goal is to make this series of a resource for businesses to help them connect with their target markets and do business better. To that end, these roundtables are being recorded and will be available on demand on the Plain English Law YouTube channel. You can find a link to our channel on our website. Please be assured that these recordings will only show the faces of the panelists. The names and profile pics of attendees will be hidden. And if you have any questions or privacy concerns about that, please get in touch directly. Again, our contact details can be found on our website. The next virtual roundtable, it will be in 2 months' time, and it is scheduled for Thursday, the 12th of May. In May, we're going to go back to basics and talk about why some businesses struggle to communicate clearly with their audience. With the help of social media strategist Peggy Harnock and executive coach Mandy Sinclair, we'll be exploring why many business processes end up being a complexity for complexity's sake exercise rather than keeping it simple and speaking plainly. We'll talk about the common traps that businesses fall into that make connecting with customers more complicated than it needs to be, and offer strategies for uncovering the hidden biases that we use that put on the brakes on our ability to innovate. There will be an Eventbrite link on our social media pages early next week, so keep an eye out for them and please sign up. Today's roundtable, of course, is all about CQ. Now, you've probably heard about IQ, which is the measure of human intelligence, and maybe even EQ, which is all about people's emotional intelligence. CQ stands for cultural intelligence and describes our ability to work with and relate to people of different cultures. How well developed a brand's CQ can affect the level of trust that brand has, depending on the marketplace. Simply put, cultural intelligence can make the difference between you winning a contract in one country and losing it in another. So to lead us through CQ and U, I'll introduce you to our panel. Our usual co-host, Niamh Kelly from TIGM, is unable to join us today, but she sends her greetings from Dublin and wishes everyone a happy St. Patrick's Day. So as today's single host, we have Trevor Fenton. Trevor is a solicitor and the founder of Plain English Law. Plain English Law is a boutique commercial law and data privacy practice, currently based in Dundee, soon to be based in Edinburgh. Welcome and congratulations, Trevor.
Thanks very much.
And please also welcome our industry expert guest, Gerry Higgins. Gerry, who is a fellow of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects, originally trained as a mechanical engineer and spent 35 years in the management of technical risk in the maritime industry with the Norwegian Classification Society, DNV. During that time, his career took him and his family to 9 different countries around the world, including Asia, Africa, and the Nordics. It was through managing business units and projects in those very different countries that Gerry realized the impact that culture has on how companies communicate, negotiate, and build relationships with businesses from different cultures. Over the past 10 years, Gerry has been working with universities, colleges, ship owners, and individuals to help them better understand cross-cultural working and help them develop their own cultural intelligence. It's great to have you here, Gerry.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Fantastic. All right. I think what we'll do is we'll start off, if you don't mind, with I'll launch it with a personal story of cultural intelligence or lack of cultural intelligence. So 10 years ago, we moved to the UK from Canada. And we found ourselves in Liverpool, and we thought, okay, we're here. Our nephews are the biggest, back in Canada, are the biggest Liverpool FC fans, and we can't be here and not get some swag for them. So we found ourselves in the Liverpool One store when it was brand new development in Liverpool. And when we were there, I was overwhelmed. I was amazed at how much stuff there was that was just full of, that was all branded Liverpool FC. And I found myself against this beside this mountain of shower accessories and, you know, these kind of spongy, meshy things, and you use with shower gel and you get it all foamy and it's great. In Canada, we call these shower poofs. Now, fresh off the boat, I didn't understand that poof means something else in UK, but besides that, there I was beside this mountain of shower accessories, and I call across the store, and forgetting that I'm in this bastion of male macho football culture, and I yell across the store, "Look, shower poofs!" And that was like one of these moments. The music stops, everyone looks at me, and I'm just like, gulp. So it's a bit awkward.
And this is the bit where I translate for the non-British audience what a poof is. In Britain, it's a very derogatory term for a gay man. So yelling this in the middle of the Liverpool Football Club store is probably not the best.
I should have done my homework, which was kind of what we're talking about today. I mean, what we're talking about, Gerry, is not so much these awkward kind of moments you can laugh about. It's kind of more serious about, you know, because these things happen with businesses and these gaffes, not just with social awkwardness, but can actually lead into some pretty serious kind of business consequences.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, that was a funny story, Lucas. Well done. Lucas was a bit sensitive about that one, thought it might not be as funny, but it was very good. Yeah, I'll be using that in the future. That's going into my material. Thank you. I'll steal with pride. Yeah, you're right. The kind of when people do things like that, these are as we discussed, the kind of do's and don'ts of culture. And what we're going to talk about today is maybe one level above or below that, more general sense. But maybe I could just start off by saying, why are we spending your valuable time on this? And the reality, as you know, is that everyone, everywhere, is communicating more and more across cultures. In companies, we have frequently multicultural teams, and those multicultural teams within the company are talking to other multicultural teams within a company, and that company is talking to other companies with multicultural teams. So there's loads of more and more cross-cultural communication happening in industry and also in our daily lives. I mean, we were just saying that the last time I had cross-cultural communication was about 3 minutes ago, because Trevor and Lucas are Canadian and I'm from UK, so we're communicating cross-culturally already. So why spend time on this? Culture has an impact on so many things, about how we feel about different things, about different situations, what we regard as being acceptable or not acceptable. If you're buying toiletries, for example. And culture determines things like, how do we organize and determine our time even? How do we handle tasks? What do we do in different cultures when we come up against business problems or challenges or difficult situations? How do we deal with them? And as Lucas said, communication. How do we communicate verbally and non-verbally? Today, I'm not going to touch on non-verbal very much, but it's absolutely another fascinating aspect of culture, is how we communicate non-verbally in different cultures. But as Lucas said, maybe today, the whole thing is about, by knowing a bit more about the cultural preferences of different cultures, we can communicate better and we can build trust. And trust really is the basis of so many, or all of our business dealings, if you like. And so building trust is a real keystone here. So my contention would be that if we understand the cultural preferences, now you hear people talking about cultural differences and cultural challenges, but I think cultural preferences is a better kind of way of describing things, because different cultures have different preferences, how they like to do things, and we'll touch on that later on. But it's only a preference. It's just what you like or you don't like, or the way you like to do something, or the way you don't like to do something. For me, broccoli. I mean, broccoli is, I don't like broccoli. That's my preference. Not a broccoli person. My wife loves broccoli. It doesn't make either of us a good or a bad person. It's purely just a preference. And that really is, it's the same with cultures. It's just a preference of the way that we like to do things in our own cultures.
And Gerry, is it also possibly a filter through which you understand? Like what I hear in Lucas's story, for example, is the gap between the message you send and the message that gets received at the other side. And some of the chats you and I have had about culture before, it seemed to me that's actually the one of the aspects that could really help a lot of us who are trying to do business across cultural boundaries is to recognize that difference and how culture can, it is the filter. Our own personal culture is the filter through which we sort of receive information from other people, and maybe can actually alter the message from what was intended when it was sent to what we hear when we receive it. So can you maybe touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely correct, of course, that that there's enough communication issues in business already without needing to, or without trying to remove one more filter if we can. And that filter is how culture can, as you say, modify the message from the sender to the receiver. Did we discuss previously about an example of that?
No, I was just thinking because the things we were talking about earlier was, businesses looking for opportunities elsewhere in the world, for example. If we sell down the street, we sort of, I guess we assume essentially that we know how it is that people in our sort of immediate area, in our local culture, how they sort of look at the world. We know how to communicate with them. And yet sometimes actually maybe we don't quite know how to communicate with them because we assume that they're operating in the same context that we are. And that's not always true, whether they're down the road or across the globe. And so, I guess it's a question of, as you said, trust, right? If you are looking to establish new business relationships with people, one of the things that's going to be critical in determining whether you get that sale or that new relationship established is whether you can build trust. And so maybe I was just kind of curious to see how do we account for those possible cultural differences, or even identify them when they aren't necessarily obvious, so that we can sort through how that would affect our approach to working with different people.
Okay. Well, since you mentioned trust and about how we know that trust is critical, how do we build trust? Different cultures build trust in different ways, dramatically different ways. So you can have cultures which are you build trust with someone through the job you do, through the task, through the way that you do a job. So, for example, a task-based culture would maybe be Northern European, say German. That kind of culture would trust you if you do a good job, you do it consistently, you do it reliably. I've worked with you. You did a good job. I trust you. So that's on one end. That's in kind of one end of the spectrum of a culture. On the other end, it's completely different. It can be just based on relationships. So relationship based. So I've spent time with you privately. We've had drinks, we've had dinner. I know your family. I know your family history. I know people who have worked with you and like you. Therefore, I trust you. And that's an area where you can have lots of not misunderstandings, but you don't get the best situation if you don't handle it properly. So what we're thinking about is, if we think about the German company, maybe going to work in a culture or to do business in a culture which is very relationship based, say, for example, Vietnam, they might be tempted to focus very much on the task and just get into the job straight away without realizing that in order to build the trust and the relationship, they need to spend a lot more time on just building the relationship, spending time asking questions, which I think probably in America, not Canada, but certainly in America, are probably illegal to ask. But they will ask questions which are very personal, very in-depth, and it's just a way to build that relationship, get comfortable, know you, and so on. So one piece of advice I always give to that people in that type of scenario is be prepared to spend a lot more time than you expected. Set time aside to build up the relationship before you dive into the nitty-gritty of the IT and the finance and the product and all of that. Because if you do, it'll just be met with a blank stare sort of thing. I don't know if that was the thing you were thinking about, Trevor.
Yeah, I mean, that's one good example. That's a new example. I hadn't sort of thought about it that way. And the funny thing is that if let's say you sort of reverse that, right? And let's say that the Vietnamese person is trying to build a relationship with me. I suspect I would find a lot of those questions really intrusive if they started asking me about my family and about my personal life and trying to get to know me. I would find that really off-putting unless I understood that's what they were doing. That's how they operated. So it's an interesting problem because I don't think a lot of us realize how instinctive some of those reactions are when we respond to someone else's style. How many of those are, I'm sitting there thinking this person's really nosy, and actually maybe they're just Vietnamese, right? Whereas they might be thinking that guy's really cold. He's got no personality, he's got no pulse, and it's actually, well, no, I kind of, I'm doing what makes sense to me. And then compare that. The third example, one of my favorites was a Polish colleague that I had in a company I used to work for. And at one point she told me privately, she said, you know what, can we just skip the small talk? I can't stand this. I dread this about dealing with my colleagues in Scotland because she's, and then there was a German colleague sitting next to her. She said, oh, I know what you mean. We actually write down before we go into a meeting, we write a little note to ourselves to remind ourselves to speak about the weather for the first 5 minutes. And like sometimes she said, and she wasn't even kidding. She said, sometimes I'm even looking at my watch wondering, have we done enough of this yet? Can we get into the business? Because that's their preferences. They just want to go straight for it. And if they do that, we're kind of like, off put because they're like, oh, wait a second, where's the banter? We need that first sort of 5 minutes of banter. Otherwise, and of course, what are you going to banter about except the weather? What else are you going to talk about?
And the reason that the weather is a great topic in Britain is that, we don't have tornadoes, we don't have kind of amazing weather, but we do have a lot of weather, which changes every 5 minutes. So it's a great topic to kind of, but just to go, you're exactly right, Trevor, that the whole thing about intercultural communication is being able to see it from the other person's perspective. And like you said, when you take the German to Vietnam, you also need to think about the Vietnam to the German. You got to worry about the poor kind of Vietnamese guys coming to Germany, walking into a meeting cold without having done the research into what's important for the Germans. And then you can just picture the scene, it all going off track before anything has started, before anything's got going. And that's why we look at these things, is because like you were saying, you would feel uneasy, you feel uncomfortable. It's just all wrong. And it's not a great basis for building trust.
There's a comment, sorry to interrupt, there's a comment that picks up just from Richard, and he says, I think it's important to do the necessary cultural research before interacting cross-culturally, which is pretty much what we're saying, isn't it? To kind of do some homework. Yeah.
And I think there's two kind of groups of homework you can do. One is this kind of stuff, which is looking at the big picture of cultures, about what are the preferences of different cultures. And I think you can dive more specifically when you do have a target. So, for example, if I'm traveling to Saudi Arabia tomorrow, I would go very much into the nitty-gritty of do's and don'ts, acceptable behaviour. What happens if I'm invited to a service or a wedding or a funeral or something? All that sort of stuff. I was going to say, Trevor, just I'd been in Indonesia about a year or so, and then I started to interact with a new client. And by this time, I'd figured out this whole task versus relationship thing. And he was a ship owner, Indonesian. And I think it was 4 meetings before eventually he kind of knew the company and he knew what we roughly did. But after 4 meetings, he says, "So what is it you want to talk about?" Because for 4 meetings, we just talked about our golf game, his family, my family. What's the difference? I mean, it's so hot here. What's the weather like in Scotland? And it's just that building up that whole rapport for relationship basis. So difficult. Sorry, I'm trying to read the comments as well. Sorry, Lucas. But I mean, we talked about culture, and we've used intercultural communication a bit. But I mean, what is the culture? I mean, what makes Canadian culture? And don't say those French fries with the cheese and stuff.
Oh, poutine. Oh, well. Okay, I was going to start there. Yes,
exactly. But it is.
And Hawaiian pizza. Don't forget, that is a Canadian invention.
So there's kind of stuff you can see like that that makes a culture, I suppose, visible and invisible. So the visible are food, dress, traditions, habits, and stuff. And then under that, the invisible are things like opinions, beliefs, assumptions, all that sort of stuff. But there's loads and loads of definitions of what is a culture. And you can say it's a complex pattern of ideas, emotions, and observable behaviors and symbols that tend to be expected, reinforced, and rewarded. So today we're talking about national cultures, but I mean, you hear about other cultures. National, professional, so lawyers versus doctors versus engineers. Organizational, so if you join a law firm from another law firm, it's got a totally different vibe. And then you've got individual cultures as well in your family, in your culture, your individual. But it doesn't matter. It's true for them all. Expected, reinforced, rewarded. It's the way things are done around here. Now, I don't know if I talked to you, Trevor, about this one before, but there's a guy in the States actually does a great experiment with an elevator. Did I tell you this?
Elevator.
An elevator, a lift.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you've been in Scotland too long. It's a lift. Not an elevator. And what he does is, if you think about going into an office block and there's an elevator and you're the first person in, so you would walk into the elevator, which way would you face and where would you stand?
I face the door and stand more or less in the middle.
Well, or closer to the buttons unless you've got really long arms.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. And if you're second, you would maybe occupy the other corner. If you're third, one of the remaining. And which way would you all be facing?
Door, I would think.
The door, yeah. So this guy's experiment, what he does is he walks in, the door's open, there's 4 people there already. He walks in and he doesn't turn around. He just looks straight ahead, just looks ahead. Now, if someone did that in an elevator, just off the top of your head, how would you feel?
I don't think I'd like that much.
Uneasy, kind of.
Yeah.
So he's got 3 levels of this experiment. That's level 1, where he walks in and just faces straight ahead. Level 2 is he walks in and then he smiles, and that really gets them going. And on at least 2 occasions, there'd been a woman at the back of the elevator this is in the States, she'd gone into her handbag, got the phone out and called the cops and said, we've got a crazy in the lift. This guy is, we need help. If you think about it, and you're a lawyer, Trevor, so I hope you would think about it, he had not broken any laws, but he hadn't done what was expected, reinforced, and rewarded. And that's a really simple example, but it shows how powerful our kind of the way they like to do things in any culture, in any situation is. It's really powerful. So he's got 3 levels. Number 1, he walks in. Number 2, he walks in and smiles. Number 3, he pushes the button to get out, but he pushes 1 level up as well. He then runs up the stairs, and when the doors open, he says, I know you were talking about me. And then they really phone the cops.
So is there any culture in which it is normal not to turn around and stand at the door? We need to know this just in case we're traveling somewhere.
Well, what I would do is, if you want to find that out, Trevor, just walk into an elevator and face straight in and see the reaction. That should give you a fairly clear indication as to whether you've done it right or not. But if you just expand that idea a little bit and think about, in Britain, for example, there's a certain culture very specific to Britain when you go into a pub. You act in a pub in a very, very cultural, very strong cultural way. If you think about a pub compared to outside of a pub in Britain or a bar anywhere else, I suppose, you walk in, you can go to the bar, order a drink, and if there's somebody beside you, you can start talking to them. Now, you would never do that sitting down on a bench in a street or just in a random situation, but in a pub, the culture is that's perfectly acceptable. It's okay. Of course, being in Britain, you would turn around and say, it doesn't matter what the weather's like, by the way, it can be snowing and blowing a gale force 9. You'll turn around and say, great weather, eh? And the other person will say, and then the conversation will start. So all of these kind of cultural norms are really ingrained in us, in our own cultures. And when we're in the culture, we understand it. And kind of when we're outside, we don't. So we kind of look at the world through our own cultural lenses, if you like. So that was a wee bit about, why we're spending time on this, because it's so universal. It's a great skill and it helps us to build up trust. And kind of what is culture. So I don't know, Trevor. Shall we do a little exercise for folk?
Got.
Okay. So just to see how things are handled a bit differently in different cultures. Can I share my screen? Is that okay, Lucas? I hope so.
I hope so, yeah. You should.
There we go. Okay. Okay. So for everyone participating, here's a little cultural ethical dilemma for you. What I would like you to do is imagine that you're a passenger in a car driven by a close friend, someone very close, friend, family, relative, partner, whatever. Unfortunately, your friend who's driving hits a pedestrian. So, now you know for sure your friend was driving at 50 in a 30 zone. Now there were, other than the two of you, there were no witnesses. Nobody else saw this. And your friend's lawyer, this is where Trevor starts to get uncomfortable. Your friend's lawyer says that if you testify under oath in court, your friend was only driving at 30, it might save him or her from serious consequences. Okay? So you're in a car driven by a close friend. Your friend hits someone. You know he or she was driving at 50 in a 30 zone. Nobody else except the two of you saw it. And the lawyer says, if you testify under oath that he was only, or she was only doing 30, it might save him or her from serious consequences. Okay? So you can guess the next uncomfortable question that is coming. And that is, would you lie in court to help your friend? I'll stop sharing. So, given that situation, would you or wouldn't you? Now, if you want, you can put into chat. Oops. If you want, you can just stick it in chat. But if not, just have an idea in your head. It's okay. I won't embarrass or anyone, and it's all anonymous. But Lucas, what would you do? No, I'm only joking.
Well, I'd be calling the Law Society to complain against the lawyer for suggesting that I lie in court, but that's quite a separate matter altogether.
Seems fair. Okay, so would you lie in court? So the reason I'm asking this question is to connect it to obviously to cultures. So I'm going to show you a range of cultures, and the higher up, it's the most likely that they would not testify in favour of the friend. And the further down it goes, means that they are more likely to testify in favour of their friend in court. So let's have a look. There we go. So on the left, you can see we've got I've coloured them blue. So we've got Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands. In the middle, we've got Spain, Italy, and India. And on the right, we've got China, Russia, Indonesia, Venezuela, and Korea. So quite a marked difference. In Korea, Venezuela, you're talking about 30%. That means 70% would lie in court in favour of their friend. In Switzerland, maybe 5% would do. And they're probably the Koreans living in Switzerland. No, but 5%. So I've coloured the Chinese, Russians, Indonesian, Venezuelans, Korean red. So what do you, why? Why would the blues not, and why would the reds help their friend? Oh, Richard. Okay. So yeah, difficult, and you're under oath in a courtroom. Yeah, that's.
It's a great situation because you are torn between being truthful, being under oath, and then compromising this relationship, and which is more like that. Yeah. And that has long-term consequences. If you rat out your friend, that's that for that friendship, isn't it? And yeah.
But obviously, people in Switzerland don't kind of feel like that, do they?
Well, I don't know if I'd be curious to find out from the Swiss and the German, all of the blue countries. I'd be curious to find out what they're weighing up, because I have a feeling that dilemma is more or less universal, right? That there is going to be a dilemma almost no matter where you fall on that spectrum. Absolutely. Because you will have that conflict between what on the one hand could be a duty to society and rules and so on, and on the other hand, a duty to your friend. So that aspect. But I think what's interesting, I think, is how I react when I see that graph at first is I immediately start thinking about ethics, who is more and who is less ethical, based on that graph. And it only occurs to me after thinking that it's like, well, I'm obviously applying some filters of my own here, interpreting it as an ethical or an unethical response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing that tends to come into play here as well, especially when I talk to people from China, Russia, Indonesia, Venezuela, and Korea, and other countries, is and it might skew this graph a bit, actually, is that it depends how much trust you have in the legal system in the country you're in.
Thought about that.
The other thing that crops up quite a lot is, sometimes I let people answer this yes, no, or maybe it depends. And quite often the depends are things like, well, do we know if the person was killed, injured, lightly injured, bruised, offended? You know, where are we on the spectrum of death, sort of thing. So that also can skew the graph. Trust in the legal system and how bad was it really. The other thing is, especially in some countries and cultures, it comes up nearly every time, and that is that there are professionals at this game that can jump in front of cars, and as the car's hitting you, you slap your hand on the bonnet, makes a big loud noise, you fall down, you know, and then it's a compensation thing. So that kind of skews things. But in the general picture, if you don't give people this, maybe it depends, force them into the yeses and nos, this is the way it goes. Sorry, Richard, you were just saying that culture, honor, shame culture. Yeah, there is definitely a bit of that. And also it's just whether it's a rules-based culture where rules are the thing that kind of drives them. So everybody is subject to the same rules and they love that consistency, or whether it's relationships that people feel you need to have a personal relationships with the rules. The rules need to be adaptable and flexible enough that you can understand every given situation. So the blue person, they're the ones that I was saying, they like the one rule for everyone, because then it's consistent, objective, predictable, and therefore fair. And the person who was treated in this way, the person who was in court, he says, I've been treated in a fair way. So that's the blues. That's your Swiss, German, kind of blue cultures, if you like, very rule-based, rule-following, rule-obedient cultures. On the other end of that spectrum, we had the reds. That was preference again, case-by-case policy, because then I know I can treat everybody in a very unique way. I can have a personal relationship-based approach. I can show discretion, make exceptions, be flexible, and therefore I can be fair. And the person thinks, I've been treated in a fair way. So both cultures think they've been treated fairly using completely different approaches, if you like. One very rule-based and one very relationship-based. So
then one of the morals of the story, if you've got a blue culture person and a red culture person who are going to get into a car together, just in case there's an accident, let the blue culture person drive.
That's one way of doing it. That could work.
Because the relationship might not survive it if it's the other way around.
Yeah. Now, there was a lot of discussion about this one, about how close is the. Interestingly, a lot of people say, how close is the relationship? And that's why I say pick a close friend, personal friend, because once you're talking to relationship-based cultures, obviously that's critical. How close is that relationship? How much trust do I have in them? So the blues, they look at the reds and they think, it's okay doing business with these guys, but I'm not sure if I trust them, And the reds, they're thinking, I like working with the blues, but when your back is against the wall, they're not there for you. That's because they don't value the relationship the way I do, sort of thing. So
I don't know if I can trust them.
Exactly. I don't know if I can trust them. So again, it's a big spectrum, but the kind of conclusions at either end are very similar. So this is one kind of cultural dimension, the rules and the relationships, or the task and relationship. And there's lots of different cultural dimensions you can look at. Obviously, you can't measure a culture on one dimension. There's got to be a few. So other ones which create issues are maybe, as I mentioned earlier, the approach to time. So if you're in the Middle East, say, and you've arranged a meeting and someone turns up 1 or 2 hours late, then they will just come in and, how are you? How's your flight? And there's no kind of issue there. Now, if it's, sorry, Eva's gone, but if it was a German, very, very focused on time, or Swiss or Japanese, very, very focused on time. You know, again, they're getting stressed, getting annoyed, getting frustrated. But if you know this beforehand, it still might annoy you, but at least you'll understand that this is just a preference of the culture you're working in.
No, I wonder how that translates in the Zoom era, because I certainly noticed something. I've always thought that I'd say British and Canadian approaches on time are fairly similar, which is to say much closer to the German end of the spectrum than the Saudi end, but still a little bit forgiving, right? So if someone's going to be, you know, up to 5 minutes late for a meeting, that's considered more or less on time. Yeah. And it's unusual, I would say, in an English-speaking workplace for someone to get really huffy about that, unless it was, you know, it's only a 15-minute meeting or something. Yeah. But I've noticed that forgiveness, both in myself and in people I'm dealing with, has been evaporating since we've all gone onto Zoom. So now it's like, okay, we had a meeting at 3 o'clock. It's 3:02. What the hell? I'm sitting here looking at this blank screen, and I wonder, you know, that might not affect the really strict cultures quite so much, because they were already strict beforehand for face to face. I think we see it in British culture, in the way we've responded to the pandemic, and I'd be curious to know in the laxer, more time relaxed cultures. I'd be curious to find out from them if they've noticed a shift in behavior because of Zoom as well.
I think that's a great point. I think what you say is probably correct, that when you're on Zoom, just the mechanics of the process, you have 5 minutes leeway, just about sort of thing. And I guess if they were to follow their kind of cultural norms, they would miss every single meeting. They'd miss every single meeting that we're supposed to be in. And I just
want a half-hour Zoom meeting and I'm an hour late. Yeah.
I just wonder how it's going to work when we revert back to face-to-face again. You know, whether that, of course, nobody knows how many of the habits and ways of working that we've picked up and adopted since the pandemic are going to remain, and how many are going to be dropped. You know, I mean, I've got hopes that going to the pub after work will be reinstated as quickly as possible. But other ones, you know, the thing about flexible hybrid working, I think there's definite massive benefits to that, unless you're in the commercial property market, of course, in which case you would kind of like everyone to go back to the office, which is reasonable. But the time thing is one that creates a lot of kind of friction. And I think the thing is, we always talk about looking through our own cultural lenses. The main thing to think about is it's not personal. It's not an insult. It's not a slight. It's just the way that the society prefers to do various things. We were invited to a wedding in Ghana, and we turned up. I was in a suit in 33 degrees and 100% humidity outdoors, and my wife was in a long dress, and it was for 2 o'clock. And we sat quietly being basted till 4 o'clock when one of the other guests turned up. And things never really kicked off till about 6:37, I think, if I remember correctly. And by this time, my suit was heading for the dry cleaners, big time, absolutely. And I thought, I was really kicking myself, because I thought, this is what you do for a living. Why did you not ask somebody? But you know, I fell back into my cultural norm. I got the invitation, I had a time printed on it. I will be there or 5 minutes late at the worst, without thinking, I'm in a different culture. I should really think about checking this out. I think the guy who just left, was it Richard?
Yeah.
he said exactly the same thing. You know, do your research before you step into a situation. And that was a really good, I have never forgot that, and I won't do it again. In Britain, it's fashionably late. 5-10 minutes is okay, but beyond that, or turning up ahead of time for an event, that creates, so time even within one culture is quite an issue. But when you look at both ends of the spectrum, it's amazing.
There's the comment came in from Peggy. She said, yes, when we're talking about the Zoom meeting, she said, amen, I subscribe to the 5-minute window for lateness on Zoom. And she has a little Canada flag there. So she's revealing her hand. But yeah, I totally.
Yeah, but that's what you say, Trevor. You know, Canada and the UK kind of aligned on that.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Lucas.
But I really do think that the people are less tolerant of the 5 minutes, even 5 minutes late for a Zoom meeting for a lot of people is starting to verge on feeling rude. And I just don't think we thought that way. 5 minutes was perfectly acceptable lateness for an in-person meeting. But although it is different, though, it depends if you're showing up, depends what kind of meeting you're showing up for and what your status is with the other person, right? If it's a coworker, I think the 5 minutes under our conception of time, 5 minutes is okay. But if you're showing up for a sales call, you're showing up to where something like that, absolutely do not be late for that. I mean, you're not going to get that forgiveness usually.
Well, one question I'm asked quite a lot is, do people who are working, for example, in international companies, do their cultural preferences change from where they were before they went into an international company? And I don't think they do, but certain behaviors change. So, for example, of an Indian, where you've got quite a time fluid approach, if they join an international company, they realize the rules of the game for that particular element, and they will adapt that and adopt that for their working life. The minute they go home again, they're back into what's expected, reinforced, and rewarded, back in their own culture again, which is perfectly normal. And then people say, well, are people's cultural preferences changing? And I think the answer is no. We can change some of the outside things like timekeeping within office hours, if you like, and Zoom calling. But the hardcore things that make Canadian culture Canadian and British and Japanese, that I don't think changes much, depending on just because you've joined an organization or joined a profession or something that is working international. So it's worthwhile keeping in mind that some behaviors, I think, people do modify, but there are way deep down, there are things that I'm going to go to the grave with them, personally speaking.
Yeah, you might adjust it for the situation, but then grumble about it later.
Yeah, a good one
privately to one of your fellow Scottish, co-workers who's dealing with a company culture that's got a head office in another part of the world that has a different approach. Oh yeah. Like, well, obviously they're setting the standards. I'll deal with it, but yeah, you're not going to like it.
No.
And you mentioned this before, Trev, in a previous conversation about how we can look at these things like challenges and problems, like these things that are kind of baked in, but but you said something about it's how you frame it, understanding both cultural lenses that you're both looking at, and that it isn't so much the environment that you find yourself in, it's your reaction, you're be able to adapt to that environment.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when I've done it successfully. And there have been times when I've done it well, and there are times I haven't done it well. But that's exactly how I've been when I've been successful. It's because I've viewed the culture as being exactly that. It's the context, right? It's the context in which I'm operating. And if I bring my own context, or if I'm with other people who share that same context, obviously it doesn't require the same level of effort, because we just have that mutual understanding of that context, and we understand how each other will react. But the minute you start throwing in people who are coming from a different context, whether it's a different national culture, or even to a certain extent class culture, even within Britain, for example. You mix groups of people who didn't grow up together, or maybe just people who sort of grew up in a football culture versus a not going to football culture. Just some of those cultural norms just aren't there. And if you are the one, the interloper, if you will, crossing into the other group, the context has changed. And it's figuring out, okay, what bits of my sort of natural context, if you will, still apply, and which ones don't do I need to learn about and figure out. So I know that when I see reactions from other people, I understand what bits of that reaction are actually their context operating to filter things that I've said and things that I've done, so that it lands with them differently. And yeah, it's a terribly challenging thing to do well, especially if you haven't done the research. And that's one thing I'd ask you then, Gerry, is how do people get figure this stuff out? What kind of resources are there for people who aren't experts in cultural communication to help themselves?
Well, there's an absolutely brilliant organization called Communicating Culture, run by a guy called Gerry Higgins.
Excellent.
No, no, it comes back to the previous comment by Richard. I think that you need to do your homework. So the resources are, obviously, there's training available from companies like mine that will give you the generic overview. And this is what we've done today, is a real super quick taster. But the generic overview of cultures and how you can measure them, and how you can compare them to one another from the point of view of where are you on that preference spectrum. And that's a great starting point. And then, as I said, if you know where you're going, you can focus in on the maybe 4 cultures that you're going to be dealing with. So if you're going to work with you're based in Edinburgh, you're going to be with a Japanese principal who then has offices in India and Norway. It's the interaction between those ones that's really interesting. And so you would dive in a bit deeper into those 4 and say, right, okay, we know the generics, we know the kind of the general stuff, but let's look at those 4 and using our imagination a bit, where do we see the opportunities? Because Lucas touched on this, that we talk about cultural challenges and difficulties, but the reality is, if you've done this homework and learned about cultural preferences, you can use that knowledge as a lever towards improving your business outcomes. So it's an opportunity. But if you know more than the other guy, and you know how this all works and how to build relationships and how to build trust, you can really use it to your commercial advantage. Now, it's not manipulating people and it's not being kind of devious. It's just that you know more about what's going on than they do.
So you know how to meet them on their turf.
Basically. Exactly. Yeah. And meet them on their turf and make sure that they understand when you do something, why you do that. Because it's not just all one way. It's not just you finding out about them. It's them finding it about you. So number 1, some basic training, then specific, and then once you start trading or working internationally, despite what I've said about opportunities, challenges will come up because of the specifics of the situation. So it's good to have someone to go back to and say, look, we went to India, this happened, we've all fallen out, we don't know why, what's going on. So that's another resource that there are providers that like mine that can help and say, well, okay, what happened, explain it to me. And then you say, okay, right, okay, maybe it could be that, bum, bum, bum. You need to be careful that you don't make everything about cultural communication, because there are jerks in the world that you just can't go on with. I mean, that's just nature, right? That's life. But when you're in that situation, more than often, it's something to do with there's been a cultural element to it. So that would be how I would suggest that you approach it. And finally, be curious. Be curious about the culture you're going to, want to know about them, and just be respectful. Learn a few words of the language. I mean, I've done that with you guys. I know about these French fries with cheese and gravy. See, I've done my homework.
You still haven't remembered the word though.
Poutine.
Poutine.
There you go. Yeah.
Which is quite hilarious when the Vladimir Putin, his name, when it's transliterated into French, it's Poutine, Poutine. So the first time I ever saw a headline on a French newspaper with Poutine does blah, 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 I found it quite hilarious because I'm imagining my French fries and gravy and cheese curds doing all sorts of things.
Of the two, I know which one I prefer.
Me too.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's how we do it.
Maybe that's a place to stop.
Sounds good.
Before we get ourselves into speaking of cultural issues.
The problem with that stuff is you can't stop. That's the problem.
Well, I'm feeling very Canadian, and I'm looking at the time, and I apologize if anyone had another meeting, but I think we should wrap it up here. But it was great. Thank you. You're absolutely right. It's just you provided this great taster, Gerry, and it's really exciting just to want to dive into it more and learn more about it. So thank you very much for all of your insight.
That was fun, guys. Thank you.
Okay. So, and thank you for everyone who's joined us. Again, the next roundtable will be in May on the 12th, and there'll be links to that to sign up to that probably closer to the date, probably a month away, but I will send the links for any of the on-demand recordings and stuff for you to catch up on. All right, so that's about it. Thanks again to everyone, and we will see you next time. Ciao for now.